Hi, Matt Kinders here for the Module 14 case study. Let's get into the stakeholders involved in this story. There's the assistant principal, Richard Inman. There are two students. The first one is James, another is David Ramos. James has a history of being more violent and involved in gang activities and is a bit older than David. David Ramos is an honor roll student involved in multiple student organizations and in the community. There's the school response officer who is involved in this situation. There's also James's teacher who witnesses an incident between James and David. There's James's mother and David Ramos's mother and their satellite family as well. The director of secondary education becomes involved in this situation, and I would argue that for the rest of the greater community within the school and within the community, and in the surrounding community is also involved in this as well. So the situation that occurs at Rockwood Junior High School, Assistant Principal Inman had summoned James, the student involved in gang activity and occasionally in violent fights at school and in the community. He had summoned James to his office to discuss some recent tardiness, which was surprising at the time because James had been making great strides in improving his behavior and attitude in school. James's teacher witnessed James transferring what they believed to be illicit substances to another student. This student was David Ramos. This was in the hallway as James was on his way to the meeting with Assistant Principal Inman. And upon hearing this news from the teacher, James's teacher, Assistant Principal Inman has the school officer deliver both students, James and David, to his office to determine what occurred during this situation. David is initially searched and found to be in possession of brass knuckles, which is a felony possession charge at school, and the officer immediately handcuffs definitely David, ends up handcuffing both students after James admits that he had coerced the young honor student David into holding on to the weapon until later. So because of this, James is also culpable in this incident, and it seems the immediate response from AP Inman is he questions the officer why David would need to be charged under these felony possession, which is obviously a very serious charge, why David would need to be charged under the circumstances if the weapon belongs to James. James brought the weapon to school, and what else can be done for David? And the officer relies on policy, and policy dictates that both students need to be arrested for the possession of the weapon. More after this particular situation occurs, Assistant Principal Inman calls both mothers to explain everything that had just happened. James's mother, who is used to this behavior, is nonplussed and understands that the principal is following protocol and doing the best they can. David's mother, on the other hand, is shocked, angry, and distraught when considering the gravity of the situation that her son is in, especially considering, I think, his prior behavior and good school performance. It's a pretty serious predicament that he is in. After these meetings, Assistant Principal Inman decides to fill out the necessary paperwork to have James removed to Disciplinary Alternative Education Program, or DAEP, and he simultaneously decides to tear up the process to have David removed to DAEP as well, to have him expelled. So in the following week, James is removed to the DAEP while David is now back in school. Assistant Principal Inman's Director of Secondary Education learns of this and informs him that Assistant Principal Inman will need to reverse course and go ahead and fill out the expulsion process in the 45 days in DAEP for David, and if he does not, if the principal Inman does not do this, he will have, a reprimand on his personnel records. So this will be a big deal for Assistant Principal Inman's career, as it turns out. So now Assistant Principal Inman must decide between following policy and keeping his career intact, or following his moral judgment and keeping the future intact of this student, David Ramos. So the synthesis of all this, James has appeared to take responsibility for bringing a felony weapon that constitutes a felony charge on campus, and at the same time David appears to be an unfortunate victim of bullying at the wrong place at the wrong time. So the people involved are the teachers of the school, particularly the teacher who witnessed the transaction between James and David. This is James's teacher. I'm sure there are many other teachers in the school more familiar with David, as well as more familiar with James, who could be relied upon to kind of build a backstory of these two students. The parents involved, that includes the fathers, any siblings, and surrounding family, but most importantly, James and David's mothers, who Assistant Principal Inman had contact with during the situation. The students, clearly James and David, but of course there can definitely be more of their peers relied upon to build a greater backstory about these students as well. There's more of the administration that is involved, particularly Assistant Principal Inman, the school police officer who made the arrests after the situation, the director of secondary education, and there's a number of other administrators who could be relied upon in this situation as well. So the legal and ethical highlights of this situation, the legal issues being that the brass knuckles on school grounds are a felony offense. That's plain and simple. Both boys must be sentenced for possession under the schools and the legal policy of the school, of the community. It's black and white. The next step would be that the student or students are removed to the DAEP for underage criminal offenders. Because this is a felony charge, this is a pretty serious incident involving minors. And another legal issue being that school policy dictates that administrators need to behave in following this law and how to uphold this law. It is their job as the administrators to ensure that these corrective actions are taken place. Now, the ethical issues being that James has admitted to bringing the brass knuckles onto campus. He has admitted to coercing a smaller and younger student into holding onto the weapon while James goes and speaks with the principal. So at first glance, it appears clear that David is not associated with any of James's designs for the weapon on school grounds or after school, however that turns out, and it seems as if David is in fact innocent of any charges leveled against him, and Assistant Principal Inman is directed to follow school policy, which he fails to do as a school leader. That is a failure of following the rules as they are laid out. The review of the unknowns is the school district itself. Is it a public school? Is it a private school? Are the school administrators, what type of relationship do they have with parents and families of the students that attend their school? The school district, where are the other administrators like the principal, and I'm sure there's many other administrators who could get involved in this as well. Another unknown is there any prior relationship between James and David? It is possible that, David being intimidated by James may not necessarily be unknown to James, or James is unknown to David. So that is something to be determined. Another thing is that it's been a week since the actual situation and where we are now, since Assistant Principal Inman has spoken with the families. What type of actions had the mothers taken or families taken on behalf of their boys after Assistant Principal Inman wrote the expulsion notice for James? and deciding not to fill out the expulsion notice for David? Do they speak with other people in the community, within the administration of the school, within the police force? There's a lot that could have happened. There's more to determine as well about the logic of the policy that two boys can be in possession of the same weapon at the same time. That by itself, after a glance at the situation, it seems a little unorthodox that two boys be charged in possession of the same felony weapon, particularly when other boy has confessed, as James did, to owning the weapon. And another thing that could be unknown, like some research of any record of prior similar instances of any of these type of occurrences at this school or maybe surrounding schools or similar districts. This information could be pretty important for Assistant Principal Inman. The options that Assistant Principal Inman can make is making no action, continuing to refuse to sign the expulsion papers for David. This could obviously harm Assistant Principal Inman's career, but it could also help him advocate for community fairness and following the policies that as dictated by the school. He could also follow the directives of the superior, deciding to sign the expulsion papers for David. Obviously, this is much better for Principal Inman personally, especially for his career. I don't think it would look that great in the eyes of the community, however, in being able to uphold justice where it's due. And the other alternative actions I kind of take into conjunction. They intermingle with each other. The first being that he could assist David's parents to make a case for David's innocence. The parents could lay out their son's schedule after school if he does any community events in the community at the local library, if he does any volunteering or has a part-time job or something of this, to determine what is he like outside of school. There's also assistance from community stakeholders like David's peers in his grade. He's in bands. If he plays any sports, what do his peers in those organizations think of his personality? And the third being asking for assistance from Assistant Principal Inman's network of peers regarding other situations similar to this one. Making no action, a pro being that David's immediate future and safety remains intact. His family will obviously appreciate it, and the community may come to understand Assistant Principal Inman's actions. A con being that his career is in jeopardy, and he's setting a precedent for breaking school policy, which is not a good role model to be setting. He could follow the directions of his superior. His career would not be in jeopardy, and he could be maintaining continuity of ethical values following procedure. David's future and safety, however, become uncertain in the DAEP program, and the family will be very unhappy. These alternative actions, if taken together, they could rally grassroots support from families and peers in support of David. Information could be provided or identified as relevant to the situation, and unfortunately, all of this falls under local jurisdiction, which may ultimately take precedence in this issue. So the best option, I believe, is that he should follow the instructions of the Director of Secondary Education, but ensure and advocate for leniency for David Ramos. He essentially needs to establish prior cases of similar, wrongful intent or just wrong place at the wrong time that occurred at this school or at other schools, and determine what other peers in AP Inman's circle has to say about this. AP Inman could advocate for deferred or remedial sentence for David, so he doesn't have to serve the whole 45 days. And he could involve community members to plead the case for David outside of school. So putting the plan into action, the teachers review David Ramos's tenure at the school. The parents and peers could synthesize information about David's actions in the community. The school officer could compile a list of who they both associate with in and outside of school to understand how culpable each student is for the transgression. AP Inman could also transcribe information that is gathered in this research, and relay all the information of his actions in the community